The map in the Tactical Operations Center was a bleeding wound. Red icons, representing enemy positions, pulsed in a tightening ring around a single, stubborn green marker labeled Firebase Kestrel. The voice crackling over the encrypted channel was thin, stretched taut by distance and desperation. Anvil, this is ODA 7214. We are taking effective fire from 3 sides. Mortars are walking in. We cannot hold past sunrise. How copy? Colonel Madsen stood before the main screen. His arms crossed so tightly the knuckles of his hands were white. His jaw was a knot of granite. Every instinct, honed by 30 years of command, screamed that he was watching the last hours of 12 good men. The weather overlay was a churning vortex of black and purple directly over Kestrel's sector. No air support could get through it. The Apaches were grounded. The A-10s couldn't see the ground. A Spectre gunship would be torn apart by the turbulence. It was a perfect storm in the worst possible place. Tell them to hold fast, Madsen said, his voice low and gravelly, directed at the comms officer. Rescue assets are on standby. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. The only asset that could even attempt a rescue was a C-17, and the only viable landing zone near Kestrel was a 3,500-foot dirt strip, now soaked and muddy, carved into the side of a mountain. The manual, the regulations, the very laws of physics said it was impossible. On the periphery of the tense circle of officers, leaning against the back wall, was Major Eva Rostova. She wasn't an operator or an intelligence analyst. She was a pilot, a transport pilot, currently flying logistics runs, milk runs, as they were called. She'd been in the TOC for an hour, watching the situation devolve, her expression unreadable. Her flight suit was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was a ghost in the room, present but unseen, her gaze fixed on the storm data, her mind tracing flight paths through the impossible terrain. She pushed herself off the wall, her movements economical and silent, and approached the command table. The men there, focused on the dying voice from the mountains, barely registered her presence. "Colonel," she said, her voice calm and even, cutting through the low hum of electronics. Madsen turned, his eyes tired and irritated. He saw a major, a pilot he vaguely recognized from a past disciplinary hearing. A hotshot who'd redlined a C-130's engines to outrun a surface-to-air missile, saving the crew but earning a career-stalling reprimand. "What is it, Major?" he asked, his tone clipped. "I can get to them," Rostova said simply. There was no bravado in her voice, just a statement of fact. A ripple of disbelief went through the officers around the table. One of them, a young captain, snorted softly before catching Madsen's glare. The colonel's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her. He saw no fear, no doubt, only a deep, unnerving focus. "Don't be ridiculous, Major. Nothing can fly in that. The wind shear alone would tear the wings off a Globemaster." "Not if you don't fight it," Rostova replied, her eyes flicking to the topographical display. "You fly with it. You use the canyons to shield you from the worst of the crosswinds. You stay below the shear layer." She was talking about a type of flying that didn't exist in any training manual. It was the stuff of folklore, of pilots who flew by the seat of their pants in wars 50 years gone. Madsen's face hardened. He saw her statement not as a solution, but as an indictment of his own powerlessness. It was the arrogance of a pilot who thought the rules didn't apply to her. It was the same arrogance that had nearly cost the Air Force a $20 million aircraft. "I am not sacrificing a C-17 and its crew on a one-in-a-million shot, Major. Your suggestion is noted and dismissed." He turned his back on her, a clear signal that the conversation was over. "Get me a direct link to the team leader. I need to talk to him myself." Rostova stood there for a moment, the dismissal washing over her without effect. She had expected it. The system was built on regulations and probabilities, not on the quiet confidence of a single pilot. She looked at the red icons pulsing on the map, at the storm that was both the prison and the potential key. She knew what the manual said. She also knew what the airframe could do in the right hands. And she knew what her grandfather, who had taught her to fly a bush plane in the Alaskan wilderness, had always said, The plane will tell you what it can do. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to no one in particular and walked out of the TOC, her footsteps making no sound against the polished concrete floor. She was dismissed, but she was not deterred. The men in the room had already forgotten her. They were now listening to the grim calculus of survival, while Eva Rostova was moving toward the flight line, her mind already deep in the storm, calculating fuel loads, approach vectors, and the precise moment to defy the laws of men and physics. Colonel Madsen's dismissal echoed in the sterile air of the command center, but it found no purchase in Eva Rostova's mind. It was just noise, another variable to be factored and discarded. He saw a problem of regulations. She saw a problem of aerodynamics. His world was bound by checklists and operational limits printed in bold, black ink. Hers was a world of pressure gradients, lift coefficients, and the subtle language of an airframe under stress. She walked through the humid night air toward the massive hangars that housed the C-17s. The wind was already picking up, a low moan that promised the violence to come. The air smelled of rain and ozone. She bypassed the formal dispatch and went directly to Hangar 4, where Reach 71 was undergoing a routine systems check. It was an older bird, one of the first in the fleet. Its skin was a patchwork of slightly different shades of gray from countless repairs. It had scars. She knew them all. A maintenance chief, a grizzled senior master sergeant named O'Malley, saw her approaching. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag. "Major, didn't expect to see you tonight. Thought you were on the early cargo run to Bagram." "Plans changed, Sergeant," she said, her voice even. "I need Reach 71. Full fuel load, and I want the medevac pallets loaded." Now O'Malley raised a bushy eyebrow. "Ma'am, with all due respect, nothing's flying tonight. Command has grounded everything until this storm passes. We're looking at 100-knot gusts at altitude." "We're not going to altitude," Rostova said, her eyes already scanning the fuselage, looking for anything out of place. "This is a command-level directive. It's time-sensitive." It was a lie, a flagrant breach of protocol. But she delivered it with an authority that left no room for argument. O'Malley, a man who had seen enough to know when a lie held a deeper truth, simply nodded. He knew Major Rostova. He'd seen her fly. He'd also heard the stories of her reprimand, and he'd always thought she'd gotten a raw deal. He trusted the pilot more than the paperwork. "My crew is on it, Major. You'll need a loadmaster." "I have one," she said, and as if on cue, a young airman first class hurried out of the shadows. Ben Carter was barely 20, with a face that hadn't yet learned how to hide his emotions. Right now, it was a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "Carter's on my crew list," Rostova stated, not asking. O'Malley nodded again. "He's a good kid." Listens, he turned and bellowed orders, and the hangar, which had been winding down for the night, roared back to life under the harsh floodlights. Rostova left them to their work and climbed the boarding ladder into the cavernous cockpit of the C-17. The flight deck was dark, the screens blank. It felt like a cathedral, silent and waiting. She ran a hand over the worn leather of the side-stick controller, a custom wrap she'd put on it herself years ago. It was from the yoke of her grandfather's old de Havilland Beaver, the plane she'd learned to fly in. The leather was cracked and smooth, molded to the shape of a hand. It was a piece of her past, a tangible link to a different kind of flying. She settled into the pilot's seat, the familiar scent of avionics and recycled air filling her senses. Her movements were a fluid, practiced ballet. She strapped herself in, her fingers finding buckles and straps by feel alone. Then she began the power-up sequence. One by one, the screens flickered to life, bathing the cockpit in a soft green glow. The head-up display materialized in the armored glass in front of her, a transparent grid of numbers and symbols. As the systems booted, she closed her eyes for a brief second, not in prayer, but in preparation. She visualized the canyon. She felt the updrafts and downdrafts. She saw the short, muddy strip at the end of it. In her mind, she had already flown the mission a dozen times. Carter appeared at the cockpit door. "Ma'am, we're loaded. O'Malley's crew is clearing the chocks." He said to tell you the tower is screaming bloody murder about an unauthorized flight plan. Rostova didn't turn. Her eyes were on the weather radar, a swirling mass of red and yellow. Let them scream, Carter. Are you strapped in back there? Yes, ma'am. His voice was a little shaky. Good. Stay on internal comms. And when the ramp goes down, make it fast. Understood. He disappeared. Rostova took a deep breath, her fingers dancing across the console, inputting the coordinates for Firebase Kestrel. The flight computer flashed a warning. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. It screamed another. Wind shear warning. She silenced them both with a flick of a switch. The computer knew the rules. She knew the exceptions. With a low growl, the 4 massive engines spooled to life, their sound a rising crescendo that vibrated through the very bones of the aircraft. She keyed the radio. Tower, this is Reach 71. Taxiing to runway 30, the reply was immediate, apoplectic. Reach 71, you are not cleared for taxi. All flights are grounded. Return to your hard stand immediately. I repeat, immediately. Rostova ignored him. She eased the throttles forward, and the 200-ton behemoth began to roll, its landing lights cutting a swath through the darkness and the driving rain. She was no longer Major Rostova, the sideline pilot. She was Reach 71, and she was going to get her people. The C-17 lumbered onto the runway, a gray leviathan against the storm-black sky. Rain lashed against the cockpit glass, blurring the runway lights into long watercolor streaks. In the TOC, Colonel Madsen was in the middle of a tense exchange with the tower chief when a new voice cut in, sharp with alarm. Sir, Hangar 4 reports Major Rostova has taken Reach 71. She's on the active runway. Madsen's blood ran cold. For a moment, he was paralyzed by sheer, incandescent rage. It was insubordination of the highest order. It was a court-martial offense. He grabbed the microphone connected to the tower frequency. Reach 71, this is Colonel Madsen. You will power down your engines and stand fast. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. The only reply was the thunderous roar of 4 Pratt and Whitney engines pushed to their takeoff thrust. The sound filled the TOC, a defiant declaration of intent. On the screen showing the airfield cameras, Madsen watched in disbelief as the C-17, impossibly large and heavy, hurtled down the runway and clawed its way into the air, disappearing almost instantly into the churning black maw of the storm. She's gone. The tower chief whispered over the comms, his voice hollow with shock. Inside the cockpit, Rostova was a study in focused calm. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as it hit the storm wall, a violent transition from controlled flight to a brawl with the atmosphere. Alarms blared, wind shear, stall warnings, proximity alerts. She ignored them, her hands light on the side stick, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals. She wasn't fighting the turbulence. She was riding it, making tiny, constant adjustments, feeling the air currents through the frame of the plane itself. This was where the machine and the pilot became one. Carter, you with me? She asked, her voice steady over the intercom. Still here, ma'am, he replied, his voice strained. Feels like we're inside a washing machine full of rocks. It'll smooth out, she promised. Though she wasn't entirely sure it was true, she pushed the nose down, descending rapidly. The plan was to get below the worst of the storm, into the relative shelter of the Gorgon Spine, a notorious network of deep, winding canyons that led toward Firebase Kestrel. It was a route no sane pilot would ever take, especially not at night, in a storm, in a plane the size of a building. In the TOC, they watched her radar signature descend at an alarming rate. She's going down. She's lost control, the young captain from earlier shouted. No, Madsen said, his voice quiet, his eyes glued to the screen. She's doing it on purpose. The green, representing Reach 71, dropped lower and lower, until it merged with the cluttered topography of the mountains. Then it vanished. The comms officer tried to raise her. Reach 71, this is Anvil. Do you copy? Silence. Reach 71. What is your status? Only the hiss of static answered. The room fell silent. The assumption was grim and unspoken. Madsen had just lost a C-17, its crew, and a major who had disobeyed a direct order. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, a crushing burden on top of the impending loss of ODA 7214. But in the darkness of the Gorgon's spine, Reach 71 was very much alive. Rostova was flying by feel, the terrain-following radar painting a ghostly green image of the canyon walls on her display. They were close, too close. The wingtips felt like they were scraping stone, though she knew she had at least 50 feet of clearance on either side. The wind howled through the canyon, creating unpredictable vortexes and eddies. She wasn't just piloting. She was anticipating, reacting to the air before the plane even felt it. A skill her grandfather had called reading the river. He'd taught her how to read the ripples on a glacial lake to know the wind above, how to watch the sway of the tallest pines to understand the currents. Now, she was reading the invisible river of the air. Her senses extended to every surface of the aircraft. For 20 minutes, she flew in this state of heightened concentration, a ghost in the machine, invisible to the world above. The canyon twisted and turned, a stone serpent in the dark. Below, a river, swollen with rain, raged white in the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the cockpit. Carter, watching the slivers of rock and water through the small portholes in the cargo bay, felt a primal fear mixed with a profound sense of awe. He was witnessing something impossible. Then, through a break in the rain, Rostova saw it. Faint, flickering light ahead. Firebase Kestrel. She'd made it through the ingress. The flight had taken her through the heart of the storm, a journey into a lethal space that no one else had dared to enter. Now, the hardest part was about to begin. She eased back on the throttles, the engine's roar softening to a whisper, and began her approach. On the ground at Firebase Kestrel, hope was a dwindling commodity. Master Sergeant Cole Gunny Riker lay behind a crumbling wall of sandbags, the stock of his rifle pressed to his cheek. Rain and mud plastered his uniform. Every few seconds, the rhythmic thud of an enemy mortar sent a plume of dirt and rock into the air, each one landing closer than the last. His team, the 12 members of ODA 7214, were scattered in fortified positions, their ammunition low, their bodies bruised and exhausted. 2 of his men were seriously wounded, their condition worsening with every passing hour. He'd just finished a call with Colonel Madsen. The official word was hold fast, the unofficial meaning was clear. You're on your own. He looked at his comms sergeant, a young operator named Diaz. Anything? Diaz shook his head, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet. Static, Gunny. Nothing's getting through that storm. Riker spat a stream of muddy water. They were good men. They had fought hard. But the math was simple and brutal. The enemy had the numbers, the position, and the weather on their side. Sunrise was 2 hours away, but it felt like a lifetime. Then came a new sound. It wasn't the whistle of mortars or the crack of rifle fire. It was a deep, guttural hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very rock of the mountain. It grew steadily, a resonant thrum that cut through the noise of the storm. One of the men, a young specialist, looked up into the black sky. What is that? Riker scanned the low, churning cloud ceiling. First, he saw nothing. But the sound was undeniable now, a powerful, tearing noise, as if the fabric of the storm itself was being ripped open. And then, for a single, heart-stopping moment, the clouds parted. Framed against the bruised purple of the storm, a silhouette appeared. It was massive, four-engined, with a high T-tail. A C-17. It was flying impossibly low, its landing lights off, a phantom slipping beneath the tempest. A collective gasp went through the defenders of Firebase Kestrel. It was like seeing a battleship appear in a pond. It made no sense. Anvil Actual, be advised. Riker yelled into his radio, his voice cracking with a mix of shock and elation. We have a heavy in the air, I repeat, a heavy in the air over our position. In the TOC, Riker's transmission electrified the room. What did he say? Madsen demanded, leaning over the comms console. Confirm that transmission. He's saying there's a C-17 over Kestrel, the officer replied, his eyes wide. On the short-range battlefield sensor network, A single friendly IFF, identify friend or foe, tag blinked into existence. It was Reach 71. She was there. She had made it. Matson stared at the green icon, his mind struggling to process the reality of it. She had flown through a kill zone, navigated a death trap, and arrived over the target, all while completely off-grid. His rigid, by-the-book world had been shattered. Inside the cockpit, Rostova had the firebase in sight. The landing strip was a short, dark gash next to the compound, barely visible. Her HUD painted a synthetic runway over the terrain, but she trusted her eyes more. "Carter, get ready. We're going in," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I'm on the ramp, ma'am. Ready for your call." She banked the aircraft, a graceful, ponderous turn that belied the violence of the air around them. This single, precise act, her arrival, had fundamentally altered the battlefield. For the men on the ground, it was a profound psychological blow against their despair. The sight of that impossible aircraft, a symbol of American power and reach, appearing from nowhere, was more potent than an artillery strike. It was a promise. Hope, which had been bleeding out into the mud, surged back with a vengeance. The enemy had seen it too. The scattered rifle fire began to converge, tracers reaching up toward the ghost in the sky. The battle wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more desperate phase. Rostova ignored the green streaks of light floating past her windscreen. Her focus was absolute, narrowed to the few hundred feet of wet earth where she had to land a 200-ton aircraft. The impossible ingress was complete. The first action had flipped the tide. Now came the miracle. The appearance of Reach 71 over Firebase Kestrel was a thunderclap that echoed all the way back to the main airbase. In the TOC, the stunned silence was broken by a flurry of activity. Colonel Matson, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, barked orders. "Get me a secure comms link to that aircraft now. I want to talk to the pilot. And get me eyes on target. Retask every asset we have that can even get close the enemy on the ground." Initially shocked by the C-17's sudden arrival, quickly adapted. The sporadic rifle fire escalated into a coordinated fusillade. Heavy machine guns, previously silent, opened up from ridge lines, their tracers stitching bright green lines in the dark, rainy sky. The mortars, which had been walking their way toward the compound's center, shifted their focus, bracketing the short, muddy landing strip. They knew what was coming. They were turning the only escape route into a killing field. Inside the cockpit, Rostova saw the muzzle flashes. The green lines of the tracers seemed to float toward her, deceptively slow, before zipping past the canopy. A rhythmic series of thuds echoed from the fuselage as shrapnel from the mortar rounds began to pepper the aircraft's skin. "Ma'am, they're lighting us up back here." Carter's voice came over the intercom, tight with tension. "I can hear rounds hitting the fuselage." "Just noise, Carter," Rostova replied, her own voice betraying no emotion. Her hands were steady, her eyes scanning the instruments, the HUD, and the dark strip of land ahead. "They can't hit anything vital from that range. They're just making a show on the ground." Master Sergeant Riker understood the enemy's shift in tactics immediately. "They're trying to deny the landing. All positions. Shift fire to the heavy gun emplacement on the eastern ridge. Suppress it." His men, galvanized by the arrival of their salvation, responded with a renewed ferocity. The volume of their return fire swelled, focusing on the identified threats. It was a desperate race. Could they suppress the enemy long enough for the C-17 to land? In the TOC, Matson finally had a comms link, patched through the battlefield network. "Reach 71, this is Anvil. Report your status and intentions." Rostova's voice came back, clear and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding on the ground. "Anvil, Reach 71 is on final approach for extraction of ODA 7214. The LZ is hot. Recommend you observe." There was no requesting permission. There was no awaiting instructions. It was a simple declaration of what was about to happen. Matson was no longer her commanding officer giving orders. He was a spectator. The doubt that had clouded his judgment began to recede, replaced by a grudging, terrifying trust. He was watching a master at work, and his role was now simply to stay out of her way. "All assets," Madsen said into his own microphone, his voice resonating with newfound authority. "Your sole priority is to provide support for Reach 71. Do whatever it takes." He was no longer trying to control the situation. He was committing to it. He was betting everything, the lives of the ODA, the aircraft, Rostova's career, and his own, on the skill of the pilot he had dismissed just hours before. The stakes had escalated dramatically. The enemy was adapting, throwing everything they had at the massive target. But command, embodied by the stunned colonel, had also adapted. Doubt had given way to a desperate faith. The entire theater of operations now held its breath, focused on a single pilot, a single aircraft, and a single impossible stretch of mud. Rostova pushed the throttles forward slightly, adjusting her glide path. The mortars were exploding on the strip now, creating muddy craters. She would have to land between them. "Hang on back there, Carter," she said, her voice a low murmur. "This is going to be a rough one." The world outside the cockpit was a storm of fire and rain. But inside, there was only the quiet hum of the avionics, the soft glow of the displays, and the absolute focus of the pilot. The world narrowed to a 3,500-foot strip of mud and rain. For Major Eva Rostova, the chaos outside the cockpit, the tracers, the mortar blasts, the howling wind, faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. Her entire consciousness was focused on the point of touchdown, a patch of earth no bigger than a parking spot, now pockmarked with fresh craters. This was the pivotal moment, the maneuver that would either save 12 lives or add 5 more to the butcher's bill. Her approach was dangerously steep, a combat descent designed to minimize time spent in the enemy's engagement envelope. The C-17, a plane designed for long, gentle landings on pristine concrete runways, was screaming toward the ground like a stricken hawk. The ground proximity warning system, which she had reactivated, blared its mechanical panic. Sink rate, pull up. From the ground, it looked like a controlled crash. Master Sergeant Riker and his men watched, their hearts in their throats. The plane was too big, too fast. It was going to overshoot the strip and slam into the mountainside. Some of the younger soldiers instinctively flinched, anticipating the fireball. In the TOC, they saw the same terrifying data. The C-17's rate of descent was triple the recommended maximum. "She's not going to make it?" the young captain breathed, his earlier skepticism replaced by horror. Colonel Madsen said nothing, his fists clenched, his eyes locked on the telemetry. Rostova's hands were a blur of controlled motion. Her left hand held the side stick, making infinitesimal adjustments to the aircraft's attitude. Her right hand rested on the 4 throttle levers. Her feet were alive on the rudder pedals, countering the vicious crosswinds that threatened to slew the plane sideways. 50 feet, the automated voice called out. The end of the runway rushed toward them. 30 feet now. With a practiced, fluid motion, she flared the aircraft, pulling the nose up sharply. The massive wings caught the air, acting as a giant brake, transforming vertical speed into a momentary, terrifying hover. For a split second, the 200-ton machine hung suspended, just feet above the mud. Then, with a calculated precision that defied belief, she slammed it down. The landing gear hit the soft earth with a bone-jarring impact that shuddered through the entire airframe. It wasn't a landing, it was an arrival, but they were still moving too fast. The end of the runway and the mountain beyond it was looming. This was the part that wasn't in any manual. This was the move whispered about by old Alaskan bush pilots, a technique her grandfather had called eating the runway. Rostova yanked the throttle levers back past the idle detent, engaging the 2 inboard Engine's thrust reversers before the nose wheel had even touched down. It was a move expressly forbidden by every operational checklist, a maneuver that put unimaginable stress on the engines and the airframe. The roar of the engines became a deafening, soul-shaking bellow as they blasted their power forward, fighting the plane's momentum. Simultaneously, she stood on the brakes, activating the anti-skid system, which pulsed violently, trying to find purchase in the slick mud. Inside the cargo bay, Carter and the pallets of medical equipment were thrown against their restraints as the C-17 decelerated with breathtaking violence. Felt like hitting a solid wall. Outside, the aircraft was a monster of controlled fury. The reverse thrusters threw up two colossal plumes of mud, rock, and water, creating a temporary wall of debris that obscured the plane from the enemy. The massive tires dug deep trenches in the dirt strip. The entire aircraft groaned, the metal screaming in protest, but it held. It held. The C-17 skidded to a halt, its nose mere yards from the end of the strip. It sat there, engines roaring, mud dripping from its wings, a defiant beast that had broken every rule to be there. On the ground, the men of ODA 7214 stared in stunned silence. They had just witnessed an act of aviation that bordered on the supernatural. Riker was the first to break the spell. "Go! Go! Go!" he roared. "Get to the bird! Now!" The pivotal maneuver was complete. It had been brutal, ugly, and mechanically abusive. It was also the most beautiful piece of flying any of them had ever seen. The instant the C-17 shuddered to a stop, its engines screaming under the strain of the reverse thrust, the rear cargo ramp began to lower. It slammed into the muddy ground with a heavy clang, a bridge to salvation. "Ramp down! Go!" Rostova's voice was sharp and clear over the internal comms, cutting through the engine roar. In the cargo bay, Airman Carter was already unstrapped and moving, a blur of disciplined energy. He directed the SF soldiers as they surged up the ramp, a choreographed explosion of desperate, efficient movement. "Wounded first," Master Sergeant Riker bellowed, his voice carrying over the din. Two soldiers carried a litter bearing their most critical casualty, while others half-dragged, half-carried another wounded man. They moved with the practiced urgency of men who lived on the edge of life and death. Carter guided them, pointing toward the prepositioned medical pallets where flight medics, part of Rostova's skeleton crew, were waiting. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, rain, and hot metal. Enemy fire intensified. Realizing this was their last chance, bullets sparked off the ramp and fuselage. Mortar rounds landed perilously close, sending geysers of mud into the air, some of it splattering into the cargo bay itself. "They're finding the range," Diaz shouted as he helped a teammate aboard. "We gotta move." In the cockpit, Rostova couldn't see the extraction, but she could feel it. She felt the shift in the aircraft's balance as the soldiers boarded. She felt the percussive thumps of nearby explosions vibrating through the landing gear. She couldn't afford to be a passive observer. Her eyes scanned the engine instruments, ensuring they weren't overheating from the massive strain of the landing. Her hand rested on the throttles, ready to push them to their maximum power for the takeoff. She was also a target. She keyed her radio, her voice still impossibly calm. "Anvil, this is Reach 71. Extraction is in progress. Enemy elements are concentrating fire on our position. Any fire support you can provide would be appreciated." Colonel Madsen, listening in the TOC, was already a step ahead. He had a pair of F-16s that had been racing toward the area, flying on the storm's edge. They were still too far away for a gun run, but they could make their presence known. "Viper flight, this is Anvil," Madsen commanded. "Descend to Angels 10. Go full burner and make a low pass over Kestrel. I want you to shake the mountain. Let them know you're here." The F-16s dove, their afterburners kicking in with a sound that ripped through the night. Even miles away, the thunder of their passage echoed through the canyons, a promise of the hellfire they could unleash. The sonic boom, when it arrived, was a physical blow that momentarily stunned the enemy, giving the ground team a few precious seconds. Riker was the last man up the ramp, providing cover fire with his rifle. He did a quick head count, then gave Carter a thumbs up. "We're all on. Get us out of here." Carter slammed his hand on the intercom button. "Last man is on. Ramp is coming up." Rostova didn't wait for it to be fully sealed. The moment the ramp began to lift, she pushed the throttles to the firewall. The C-17, heavy with its new passengers and groaning from the abuse it had endured, began to move. It had less than 3,000 feet of chewed-up, cratered mud to get airborne. She used a technique that was pure brute force. With the brakes locked, she ran the engines to full power. The aircraft strained against them, shaking violently, a chained beast desperate to be free. Then she released the brakes. The C-17 leaped forward, accelerating with a ferocity that threw the soldiers back against the cargo bay walls. It bounced and skidded through the mud, hitting a shallow crater that sent a violent jolt through the cabin. Rostova held the controls steady, fighting to keep the plane straight. Just as she was about to run out of runway, she pulled back on the side stick. For a sickening moment, the plane refused to fly. It was too heavy, the air too thin, the ground too soft. Then, with a final, shuddering groan, the wheels left the mud. Reach 71 was airborne, clawing for every inch of altitude, its wings seeming to brush the treetops on the far side of the valley. The extraction was complete. She had covered them, and now she was taking them home. The flight back was a tense, humming silence, broken only by the whisper of the avionics and the murmur of the medics working on the wounded in the back. Rostova flew with the same preternatural focus she'd displayed on the way in, navigating the edge of the storm, her path a smooth, efficient line back toward home base. The C-17, though battered and bruised, performed flawlessly. It was a testament to its rugged design and the skill of the pilot who had pushed it far beyond its limits. As they approached the base, the rising sun began to paint the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink, the first light after a long, dark night. The storm had broken. Rostova landed Reach 71 with a textbook gentleness that was the complete opposite of her arrival at Kestrel. The massive aircraft kissed the concrete, its tires barely making a sound. It was as if she were apologizing to the plane for the abuse she had put it through. She taxied to a remote hardstand, away from the main flight line, where a fleet of ambulances and security vehicles were waiting, their lights flashing silently. The engines spooled down with a long, mournful sigh. The silence that followed was profound. Before the ground crew could even attach the stairs, Colonel Madsen's vehicle screeched to a halt beside the cockpit. He stepped out, his face unreadable, a thundercloud of authority. He was there not to welcome a hero, but to confront a mutineer. He stood at the bottom of the crew ladder, waiting. Rostova finished her shutdown sequence, each flip of a switch deliberate and final. Then she unstrapped and descended the ladder to face him. She stood before him, her flight suit stained with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion, but her back was straight. She offered no excuses, no apologies. She simply waited. "Major Rostova," Madsen began, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You are aware that you disobeyed a direct order. You are aware that you commandeered a multimillion-dollar asset without authorization. You are aware that you are facing a general court-martial and the end of your career." As he spoke, the rear ramp of the C-17 lowered, and the men of OD 7214 began to disembark. They were muddy, bloodied, and utterly exhausted, but they were alive. Master Sergeant Riker, his face grimed with dirt, saw the confrontation. He walked over, his stride heavy but purposeful, and stopped beside Rostova. He looked Madsen directly in the eye. "Colonel," Riker said, his voice raspy, "I've been in this man's army for 25 years. I've seen pilots and I've seen aviators. Tonight, I saw something else entirely." He turned his head slightly toward Rostova. "I flew with her father back in the 90s. He was a legend. They called him Ghost because he could take a C-130 places it had no business going. He had a way of flying that was more art than science." He paused, then looked back at Madsen. "Tonight, I didn't see the Ghost's daughter. I saw the Ghost herself. The way she handled that bird in the storm, the way she put it down on that patch of dirt. There's only one pilot I've ever heard of who could do that." A few of the older NCOs and officers who had gathered nearby began to murmur. The name was a piece of folklore, a legend from the Special Operations Aviation community. "They had a call sign for a pilot like that," Riker said, his voice dropping. "A pilot who could fly through the darkest night, who could appear from nowhere when all hope was lost." He looked at Rostova, and for the first time, a glimmer of a smile touched his lips. "They called her Nyx," the name hung in the air, electric. Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a reputation, a legacy. Madsen stared at Rostova, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a reckless major who broke the rules. He was looking at a living legend, a pilot whose skills were a generation beyond his comprehension. He looked from her to the battered C-17, then to the 12 men she had brought back from the dead. The rigid certainty of his world, built on regulations and procedures, had been irrevocably broken. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The court-martial was forgotten. The reprimand was irrelevant. All that was left was a stunned, silent respect. Riker gave Rostova a slow, deliberate nod. It was more than a thank you. It was a sign of profound, professional acknowledgement. He then turned to assemble his men. The recognition was complete, not in a parade or a medal ceremony, but in a quiet moment on a windswept tarmac, with a name spoken like an incantation. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The organized chaos of the arrival had subsided. The ambulances were gone, taking the wounded to the base hospital. The men of ODA 7214 had been whisked away for debriefing and a much-needed rest. The security teams had dispersed. All that remained was the silence, the cooling engines of Reach 71, and Major Eva Rostova. She stood alone beside the massive aircraft, the cool morning air a welcome balm on her skin. She didn't head for her own debrief or seek out a bunk. Her duty wasn't finished until her plane was settled. She walked the length of the fuselage, her hand trailing along the cold aluminum skin. She ran her fingers over the new scars, the pockmarks from shrapnel and the long gash from a piece of flying rock. Each one was a testament to the night's violence, a line in the story they had just written together. Her plane had groaned and screamed, but it had not broken. It had done everything she asked of it, and more. She stopped by the nose gear, looking up at the cockpit, a dark, impassive eye staring out at the world. The bond between a pilot and their aircraft was a strange, intangible thing. It was a partnership built on trust, knowledge, and a shared experience of defying gravity. Tonight, that bond had been forged in a crucible of storm and fire. She leaned her head against the fuselage, the vibrations of the cooling systems a faint hum against her forehead. She could smell the jet fuel, the ozone from the storm, the wet earth that still clung to the tires. It was the perfume of her life's work. A single vehicle approached, moving slowly, and stopped a respectful distance away. It was Colonel Madsen. He got out but made no move toward her. He simply stood and watched. He had spent the last hour in the TOC, reviewing the black box data from Reach 71. The raw numbers told a story even more incredible than what he had witnessed. The flight path through the canyon, a thread of impossible precision. The G-forces on landing, far exceeding structural limits. The stress on the engines from the pre-takeoff reverse thrust. The data was a cold, hard, mathematical proof of a miracle. He had come to understand that he hadn't been wrong to dismiss her. The mission, by every rational standard, had been impossible. His mistake was in failing to account for the human element, for the pilot whose skill transcended the standards. He had commanded a force, but she had commanded an aircraft with an intimacy he could never comprehend. Rostova eventually pushed herself away from the plane. She gave the nose one last, gentle pat, a silent thank you. She turned and saw Madsen. They looked at each other across the expanse of concrete. There was no need for words. He gave her a single, slow nod. It was not the nod of a superior officer to a subordinate. It was a nod of pure, unadulterated respect. An admission, an apology, an acknowledgement of mastery. He got back in his vehicle and drove away. Rostova watched him go, then turned her gaze back to the mountains on the horizon, the direction from which she had come. The storm was gone, leaving the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze. All was quiet. Her dignity, which had never been surrendered, remained fully intact. She was Nyx. She was Major Eva Rostova. She was a pilot, and her plane was safe. That was all that mattered. She took a final look at Reach 71, then turned and walked toward the hangar, her shadow long behind her in the morning light. The legend was real, but the work was done. Now there was only the silence.